The Mafia didn't lose because the FBI had more guns. They lost because one agent understood how their minds worked. For decades, the Mafia operated in plain sight, untouchable, unshakable, and silent. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence evaporated. Trials collapsed. Entire law enforcement task forces failed, not because they lacked resources, but because they misunderstood the enemy. They treated the Mafia like criminals who feared prison. They were wrong. The Mafia didn't fear prison, they feared humiliation, loss of status, and being forgotten. Before we go further, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? And if you want more deep dives into criminal psychology and the hidden battles behind major crime cases, subscribe to Criminology, like this video, and turn on notifications. These stories aren't just about crime, they're about how minds are broken. To understand how an FBI agent outsmarted the Mafia, you first have to understand how the Mafia thinks. The Mafia is not just an organization, it's an identity system. Loyalty is not a value, it's survival. Respect is not earned once, it must be constantly reinforced. Reputation is currency. Fear is infrastructure. From a psychological perspective, the Mafia operates on three core pillars: honor, dominance, and silence. Honor isn't moral, it's performative. It exists to signal strength and command obedience. Dominance is not about violence alone, it's about perception. And silence, known as omertà, is not just a rule, it's a psychological cage. Omertà works because it ties identity to secrecy. To speak is not merely to betray information, it is to erase oneself. A man who talks loses his status, his history, his meaning. In Mafia psychology, death is sometimes preferable to being remembered as a rat. Traditional policing never accounted for this. The FBI tried: wiretaps, raids, informants, arrests. But every tactic assumed the same thing. That pressure would break people. That fear would create cooperation. Instead, pressure hardened loyalty. Every arrest reinforced the narrative. Every raid confirmed the belief that the outside world was hostile and corrupt. Every failed prosecution strengthened internal bonds. The Mafia didn't survive. Despite law enforcement, it survived because of it. This is where the FBI agent, the one who changed everything, made a crucial realization. You don't destroy an identity by attacking it. You destroy it by making it unlivable from the inside. The agent understood something most investigators missed. Mafia members didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as elite insiders, smarter, tougher, more honorable than the system chasing them. Prison wasn't failure. Getting exposed as weak was so instead of hunting the Mafia, the agent studied them. He studied how they spoke, how they competed with one another, how respect was earned and lost. He noticed that beneath the surface, unity was a constant, quiet rivalry. Status was fragile. Ego was everything. From a criminal psychology standpoint, this was the opening. Ego is a double-edged sword. It creates discipline, but it also creates vulnerability. The stronger the ego, the harder it is to tolerate disrespect. Invisibility, or being outplayed, the FBI agent realized that the Mafia's greatest strength, its obsession with reputation, could become its greatest weakness. But there was a problem. Direct confrontation would never work. Accusations would trigger silence. Threats would reinforce loyalty. Surveillance would push communication deeper underground. Any visible pressure would unify them. So the agent did something counterintuitive. He became predictable. He didn't rush arrests. He didn't make grand statements. He didn't posture. He allowed small crimes to continue unchallenged. From the outside, it looked like inaction. From the inside, it looked like safety. This was not incompetence, it was psychological bait. Criminal psychology shows that people make their biggest mistakes when they believe they're in control. The Mafia interpreted the lack of pressure as dominance. Confidence grew. Conversations became looser. Pride expanded, and pride demands recognition. The agent understood that Mafia members didn't want to hide forever. They wanted to be seen by rivals, by subordinates, even by law enforcement. Power that isn't acknowledged feels incomplete. So instead of threatening them, he allowed them to feel superior. Every meeting that went uninterrupted, every operation that wasn't immediately disrupted, Every moment of apparent freedom fed a dangerous belief. We're winning. This belief changed behavior, communication increased. Jokes became careless. Boasts slipped into conversations. Hierarchies were reinforced verbally instead of quietly. Criminal psychology tells us that when people feel untouchable, they stop guarding details, especially details that signal status. And status was everything. The agent paid close attention to how Mafia members talked about one another, who took credit, who felt overlooked, who felt disrespected. These were not just personalities, they were fault lines. Loyalty in the Mafia is conditional. It lasts as long as identity is protected. The moment a man feels diminished, loyalty begins to crack. The FBI agent didn't exploit fear, he exploited pride. He allowed comparisons to form, he let egos collide. He made sure certain actions were noticed, not publicly, but internally. Small shifts in perceived respect created tension. Tension created resentment. Resentment weakened silence. And all of this happened without a single threat. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. From the inside, pressure was building, not from law enforcement, but from the psychological weight of rivalry, insecurity, and status anxiety. This is the most important lesson. The Mafia wasn't defeated by force, it was destabilized by self-comparison. Once identity becomes competitive rather than collective, silence becomes fragile. People don't break because they're scared. They break because they feel unseen, unappreciated, or outplayed. And the FBI agent knew exactly when to wait and when to move. We'll break down how the agent turned ego into a weapon, built trust without loyalty, and made powerful men believe they were controlling the game right up until the moment they weren't. The most effective psychological traps don't feel like traps at all. They feel like freedom by the time the FBI agent moved into the second phase of his strategy. The Mafia believed they were operating in a position of strength. Law enforcement pressure seemed inconsistent. Arrests were selective. Surveillance felt distant. From their perspective, the system had lost momentum. That perception was carefully engineered. Criminal psychology shows that people take the greatest risks not when they are desperate, but when they feel secure. Security lowers vigilance. It creates comfort. Comfort invites carelessness. And carelessness is where power begins to leak. The agent understood that trust doesn't require friendship. It requires predictability. He became predictable in his patterns, restrained in his actions, and methodical in his responses. The Mafia didn't see him as a threat. They saw him as part of the environment, something to work around rather than fight against. This psychological downgrade was intentional. Attention shifts inward, and inward is where the Mafia was weakest. Inside every criminal organization, hierarchy is never as stable as it appears. Respect must be constantly maintained. Authority must be reinforced. Criminal psychology shows that power structures built on fear and image are fragile because they depend on continuous validation. The FBI agent exploited this by allowing internal competition to surface naturally. He didn't spread rumors, he simply allowed certain actions to go unnoticed while others were indirectly acknowledged. Small victories were visible to some members, but not others. Over time, this created an imbalance of recognition. Recognition is oxygen for ego. Those who felt seen became bolder. Those who felt overlooked became resentful. And resentment, left unattended, corrodes loyalty faster than fear ever could. One of the most effective tactics the agent used was strategic patience. Instead of making arrests when evidence first appeared, he waited. He watched patterns develop. He allowed behaviors to repeat. This wasn't negligence, it was data collection. Criminal psychology emphasizes that repeated behavior reveals priorities, and priorities reveal pressure points. The Mafia misinterpreted patience as weakness. That mistake was critical. Believing they had time, members began speaking more freely. Meetings grew longer. Conversations expanded beyond necessity. Pride crept into language. People talked not just to communicate, but to impress. This shift mattered. When criminals speak to impress, they exaggerate. They simplify. They claim ownership. They distort responsibility. Each distortion leaves a psychological fingerprint. The agent didn't intervene. He observed another psychological lever the agent pulled was the illusion of control. At key moments, he allowed minor operations to proceed unhindered. From the Mafia's perspective, this confirmed dominance. They believed law enforcement was always reacting, never anticipating. This belief emboldened them. Criminal psychology shows that perceived dominance leads to cognitive shortcuts. People stop planning carefully. They rely on habit. They assume yesterday's success guarantees tomorrow's safety. That assumption is lethal. As confidence grew, internal discipline weakened. Protocols loosened. Communication channels expanded. People spoke in places they previously avoided. They assumed surveillance had faded. They assumed risk had decreased. In reality, exposure was accelerating. The agent also understood the power of silence. He didn't signal concern. He didn't issue warnings. He didn't escalate visibly. Silence allowed the Mafia to narrate their own story, one where they were winning. That narrative became psychologically expensive to abandon. The more they invested in the belief of control, the harder it became to imagine. Vulnerability, and then came the cracks. They didn't appear as betrayal, they appeared as carelessness. A comment made too openly. A boast shared too widely. A complaint about leadership voiced in the wrong setting. Each moment alone meant little. Together, they mapped internal fractures. Criminal psychology teaches that organizations don't collapse from external attack. They collapse when internal cohesion fails. The agent began to see shifts in behavior. Some members became louder. Others became quieter. Authority was challenged subtly through jokes, delays, and passive resistance. These were not signs of rebellion. They were signs of psychological fatigue. The Mafia's silence was no longer unified. It was fractured by ego. At this stage, the agent still didn't act. This restraint was the most dangerous part of the plan. The Mafia interpreted continued inaction as proof they were untouchable. That belief fed overconfidence. Overconfidence fed exposure. Exposure fed evidence. Criminal psychology explains this as the confidence collapse cycle. The stronger the belief in safety, the weaker the actual security becomes. Eventually, one miscalculation changed everything. A member sought recognition, not protection, not money, recognition. That need drove him to talk more than he should have, not to law enforcement, but to peers. He wanted his role acknowledged. He wanted his contribution known. In doing so, he connected dots that were meant to stay separate. That was the moment the structure began to fail. Because once information circulates internally, it leaks externally. Not immediately, not deliberately, but inevitably. The agent had been waiting for this. He didn't rush. He didn't intervene publicly. He allowed the ripple to spread. Each additional conversation widened the crack. Each repetition increased distortion. The truth became unstable. This instability weakened omertà, not through fear, but through confusion. People weren't sure who knew what. They weren't sure who had said too much. They weren't sure who could be trusted. And uncertainty is poison to organizations built on silence. The Mafia didn't realize it. But the psychological battle was already lost. The final move was not dramatic. That was the point. By the time the FBI agent was ready to act, the Mafia had already begun to undo itself. Silence was no longer unified. Loyalty was no longer absolute. Confidence had curdled into paranoia. The organization still looked powerful from the outside. But internally, it was unstable, and instability is fatal to systems. Built on control. Criminal psychology teaches a critical truth. People do not betray organizations when they are afraid. They betray them when identity fractures. The Mafia's greatest weapon had always been omertà silence, enforced through fear and honor. But the agent understood that silence only holds when individuals believe the group protects their identity. Once that belief weakens, silence becomes a burden instead of a shield. The agent didn't try to smash omertà. He made it psychologically expensive to maintain. As internal distrust grew, members became hyper-aware of how they were perceived. Who was respected? Who was sidelined? Who might be blamed if things went wrong? The shared identity that once bound them together began to feel unsafe. This is where the agent made his most precise move. Timing. He waited until the Mafia believed two things simultaneously. That law enforcement pressure was minimal, and that internal loyalty was uncertain. This combination is psychologically destabilizing. People feel exposed, but not threatened. Anxious, but not cornered. That emotional state invites mistakes. Rather than launching mass arrests, the agent applied selective pressure. Minor charges here. A quiet arrest there. Nothing loud, nothing sweeping. Each action felt isolated, but together they sent a subtle message. Someone is talking. Criminal psychology shows that the fear of betrayal is more powerful than the fear of punishment. Prison can be endured. Being exposed as disloyal cannot. The Mafia didn't know who had spoken, or if anyone had. That uncertainty was the weapon. Paranoia spread. Conversations shortened. Meetings fractured. Trust evaporated. Members began withholding information from one another, trying to protect themselves. The very silence that once protected the organization now prevented coordination, and without coordination, power dissolves. The agent also understood the psychology of exit most. People don't defect suddenly, they defect gradually. First, emotionally, then cognitively, finally, behaviorally. The agent watched for those stages. He didn't pressure individuals who were still loyal. He waited for signs of internal disengagement. When contact was finally made, it wasn't framed as betrayal, it was framed as survival with dignity. This was crucial. The agent didn't insult the Mafia's identity. He didn't ridicule their past. He acknowledged their intelligence, their discipline, their skill. Criminal psychology shows that people are more willing to abandon a group when they can preserve a positive self-image. Defection didn't feel like weakness, it felt like outgrowing a broken system. The first cooperation occurred quietly. Carefully, momentum shifted. Not because information flooded out, but because belief collapsed. Others realized silence no longer guaranteed protection. And when silence fails, it fails fast. The final arrests were almost anticlimactic. There were no shootouts, no dramatic standoffs. The groundwork had already been laid. Evidence was complete. Timelines were clear. Communications had been mapped. The Mafia didn't fall in a moment. It expired. What stunned observers was not that arrests happened, but how little resistance followed. The psychological war had already been won. In the aftermath, analysts recognized something profound. The FBI agent hadn't defeated the Mafia by overpowering it. He had defeated it by outlasting its psychology, by allowing ego to inflate, by letting rivalry erode unity, by turning identity into liability. This case reshaped how law enforcement thought about organized crime. Force was no longer the primary weapon. Understanding was. Criminal psychology became central to strategy, not as a supplement, but as the foundation. Organizations realized that the most dangerous enemy is not the one you confront, it's the one you understand better than they understand themselves. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond the Mafia. Power that relies on image is fragile. Loyalty that relies on fear is temporary. Silence that relies on identity collapses. When identity fractures, the FBI agent didn't break the Mafia. The Mafia broke itself, guided quietly by psychology. Now tell me in the comments, which psychological tactic do you think was most decisive? Patience, ego manipulation, or strategic silence? If this story changed how you understand power and control, like this video, subscribe to Criminology, and turn on notifications for more deep dives into criminal psychology and the unseen battles behind major crimes. Because the most dangerous weapon in anywhere isn't force, it's understanding. The mind that believes it can't lose.